morning. I'm Ms. Brown, your host today for African American Studies. Your essential question is: in what ways did African Americans contribute during the Civil War? Let's get started. Lincoln takes office in March 4th, 1861. He hoped that states would return peacefully to the Union. So at this point, they have succeeded. So if you were following us last week, Lincoln took office on March 4th, 1861. So if you remember from last week, several states have seceded right after Lincoln takes office. But he hoped that states would return peacefully to the Union. Instead, war comes about 2 months later when Fort Sumter is attacked. So Fort Sumter is an arsenal, it's a place that has a lot of weapons. It is owned by the United States at this point, but of course the United States has now fractured. And it is located in South Carolina. So does it belong to the South or to the North? Who knows? Either way, they both disagreed on who owned it, and so they each converge upon this area. And eventually shots ring out. Some people say it's from the South. Who knows? And ultimately, this is the beginning of the Civil War. Initially, blacks were turned away from fighting, but eventually they were allowed in segregated units. That means all black units. Before this, though, they held non-combative ways. Before this, they helped in non-combative ways, such as growing and cooking foods or driving the wagons. Why do you think they were reluctant to allow blacks in the army? As more and more people died, white people by the way, they decided to arm black troops. That included the Confederacy. Now, if you don't know, you have the Union, that's basically the North, maybe the West, and then you have the Confederacy or the Confederate States of America, and that's the South. And so these two places are what made up the United States at first, but fractured into the Union, which was the North, and the Confederacy. So both sides are eventually going to decide to arm blacks to fight in this war. The Confederacy has a lot less luck on that avenue, of course. And they don't even start trying to arm black troops until March of 1865. And if you know anything about the Civil War, it ends about a month later in April, right around the time that Lincoln is shot. Let's talk about the hardships and heroism during the Civil War. Did you know that black troops got less supplies, less money, and less training? Did you know that the Confederacy captured white soldiers and they became POWs or prisoners of war? But if you got caught as a black soldier by the Confederacy, you were executed or enslaved. Did you know that a quarter of all Union soldiers were black and many received awards for their amazing service? Did you know that? Question 1. Identify the steps that led to the recruitment of black troops in the Civil War. So, what ends up causing them to allow black troops in the Civil War? I said, hey, ladies, yeah. Are y'all wondering what we did during the Civil War? How about nurse the soldiers, cook and sew? And some of them, like Sojourner Truth, met with the president who convinced her to be a nurse at the Freedmen's Hospital. Speaking of women, did you know that Elizabeth Browser worked in the Confederate president's house? So the Confederate president was Jefferson Davis. She worked in his house as a slave and convinced them that she could not read. They just assumed, of course, that she was a slave and could not read. And so they would leave papers around and she would pick those papers up and read them and say, oh, so the Confederate troops are moving to South Carolina on Wednesday at 6 p.m. And so she would pass this information along to the Union, and they would miraculously figure out, of course, what the South was going to do. And eventually he figures out that she is the spy, but she gets away before anything happens. In what ways did African Americans contribute to the war effort for both the North and the South? Actually, in what ways did African Americans contribute to the war effort for the North? I know I have on here the South. Don't worry about the South. Just tell me how they contributed to the war effort for the North. One crucial unanswered question: what would Lincoln do about the issue of slavery? Abolitionists argued war is pointless if we're not going to end slavery. Many white Northerners opposed emancipation. If you don't know, emancipation means freedom, or the freeing of slaves. Here's the dilemma. I'm Lincoln. If I end slavery, what happens to the border states? Those are the states on the border that still have slaves, and for now are still siding with the Union. They haven't seceded. Will they join the Confederacy? If I don't end slavery, then what is all this for? What would you do? As you can see here, several states like Delaware, Kentucky, Maryland, Missouri all stayed in the Union. But there was concern that if slavery was completely abolished and they had slaves, that they'd leave the Union and join the Confederacy, which would give more money and power to the Confederacy and possibly make them lose the war. Also, what do you do with contraband, which are the things you take from the enemy? So some of the contraband that the Union had were slaves. They would capture slaves, or not capture them, but slaves would come into their employ through them fighting, and they would get slaves. And occasionally, or in the beginning, they would send those slaves back to their slaveholders. But then you had a lot of abolitionists say, well, you're just helping the Confederacy. You're helping them win. We should keep those slaves. This makes it harder for them to win if they lose their slaves. So eventually they stopped sending the contraband or slaves back, and they eventually start freeing those same slaves. Finally, Lincoln decided that he would just abolish slavery in all states that were in open rebellion. In other words, the states that seceded, all those slaves were free. So Mississippi, Texas, those areas. This did not apply to those border states that still had slaves. Those slaves were still enslaved, and Lincoln proposed to give money to the border states to free those slaves eventually. Of course, the border states refused, and so Lincoln has to determine what to do. But he was eventually convinced that he had to end slavery, as this would hurt the South and help them win the war faster. Finally, after a lot of politics and hemming and hawing, slavery was abolished in all U.S. territories, except the border states. Lincoln waited to do this until he had a large victory. That victory came in the Battle of Antietam in September 1862. So how did people respond? Some thought it did too much, others not enough. Some white soldiers refused to fight for slaves and just up and threw down their guns and swords and walked away. Other people were worried about blacks taking all their jobs. So if we free all these hundreds of thousands of slaves, they're going to rush to the North and take our jobs. And some thought freeing the slaves would help speed up the war and make sure that the Confederacy lost if they didn't have slaves to work and help them. Did you know that many slaves, upon hearing that they were free, put down their rakes and hoes and escaped to Union lines. It is rumored that the Union soldiers began freeing over 1,000 slaves per day. As feared, this emancipation, again, emancipation means freeing or freedom, hurt the Confederate Army because slaves began running away, especially if the men of the house were off fighting. It also ended support by foreigners like Great Britain. Now, if you remember, Great Britain buys a lot of the cotton that is produced in the South. But Great Britain had already banned slavery about 30 years before. And so there was this big movement there to not support slavery here. But of course, how will they get their cotton and some of the other goods that come from slavery? Question 3. What led Lincoln to issue the Emancipation Proclamation? Make sure you're writing in complete sentences. So if I was to write this, I would again take out the question words and say, Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation because he felt that there was no point in going to war over slavery if you don't end slavery. I want to make sure that you understand that he did not support slavery, but he was okay with slavery sticking around. He never wanted to go to war over slavery. Make sure you got that. Did you know that the Emancipation Proclamation was considered one of the most important documents of all time? It was the precursor to the 13th Amendment, which you'll learn about more next week and in one of your IP activities. What do you know about Juneteenth? There's been a growing number of African Americans that are no longer celebrating July 4th, but instead celebrating June 19th, since that was the day that blacks were actually set free. And I'm one of them. One of those people who turned up on June 19th. What can you do to celebrate Juneteenth this year that will celebrate the amazing history of blacks in America and abroad? And some of those African Americans I'm talking about are the Mansa Musas, the Elizabeth Browsers, the Harriet Tubmans, and some of the other people you've learned about in the past 6 weeks. Before I let you go away, let me tell you about your independent practice. All right, so you have one independent practice activity, but it has 2 tasks. First, you're going to fill out this graphic organizer, basically telling me why people were for emancipation and why they were against it. Then you're going to make a Flipgrid video. So, got questions? Come on to Zoom or write your questions down and let's talk about it. Bye.